The morning the loan officer told me I was in over my head, it was 61 degrees outside and raining sideways, the kind of Willamette Valley rain that doesn't fall so much as hang in the air and soak you anyway. I remember the date because I'd written it on the back of my hand in ballpoint pen so I wouldn't forget the appointment. Tuesday, September 20th, 2022, 9 days after the funeral. 11 days after I'd learned I owned 41 acres, a barn, and a debt I hadn't chosen. The co-op office smelled like wet wool and burnt coffee. He had my great-aunt's account open on the screen, the green cursor blinking next to a number that didn't move no matter how long I stared at it. $4,800, owed against unsold raw fleece sitting in bags in her barn since spring shearing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He just turned the monitor a few degrees toward me, the way you'd show a child a math problem they'd gotten wrong, and said that with prices where they were, and a farm that size, and no offense intended, but did I have a plan, or did I have a barn full of wool nobody wanted, and a debt with my name on it now? I said I had a plan. I didn't. Not yet. I had a dead woman's flannel shirt still hanging on the hook by her kitchen door, and a barn I hadn't been inside more than a dozen times in my life, because she kept the dye room locked and told me, every single time I asked, that I'd understand when I was older. I was 18. I didn't feel older. I felt like a girl standing in a bank-smelling office being told, gently, condescendingly, that the smart thing to do was sell the flock, sell the land, to whoever was already circling it, and go do something else with my life. I drove home that afternoon on Bellinger Road, with the wipers barely keeping up, past the Kessler place, where thin gray smoke was already rising off a burn pile near the Huller, the way it did every September, husks and hulls stacked and set alight, because that's what you did with green walnut waste. You burned it. You didn't think twice about it, same as your father had, and his father before him. I didn't think twice about it either, not that day. What I did think about, pulling into the gravel drive with the debt number still sitting behind my eyes like a bruise, was the barn door at the far end of the property, the one with the padlock I'd never had the key to, the one she'd always called the dye room, like it was a place instead of a habit, and I sat in the truck a long minute in the rain before I went and found the crowbar. The padlock had rusted to the color of dried blood, and it gave up faster than I expected, the hasp shearing clean off the old wood with a sound like a knuckle cracking. I stood there with the crowbar still in my hand, rain running off the brim of my cap, and pushed the door open with my shoulder because the bottom hinge had dropped and it dragged across the concrete. The smell hit me before my eyes adjusted, lanolin gone sour with age, and under it something sharper, almost like ink, almost like tea steeped too long. Dust hung in the light from the door in a way that made the whole room look underwater. There were 3 enamel basins stacked against the far wall, their bottoms stained a color I didn't have a name for yet, somewhere between rust and coffee and old blood. A row of mason jars sat on a shelf she'd built herself. You could tell, because the boards weren't level and the nails were the wrong size for the job. Every jar was empty. Every jar was labeled in handwriting I recognized from grocery lists and Christmas cards, small and slanted and pressing hard enough into the paper that you could read some of the words from the backside of the label. I didn't touch anything that first evening. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell it like I walked in and understood right away what I was looking at, like some instinct in my blood recognized the room. It didn't. I stood in the doorway with rain coming through my collar and I thought, this is where an old woman kept jars, and that's all I thought. I was 18 years old and I had a $4,800 note at the co-op and a truckload of unsold fleece rotting slightly at the edges in the barn loft, and a padlocked room full of empty jars did not strike me, that night, as anything but one more thing nobody had told me about. It was the notebook that changed it, and I almost missed that too. It had slid down behind the third basin sometime in the last decade, warped along one edge from damp, and when I pulled it free, the cover came apart in my hand like wet cardboard. I carried it inside under my jacket, like it was something that could still get more ruined than it already was. My hands were shaking, though I told myself it was just the cold. I set it on the kitchen table next to the unopened letter from the co-op, next to the calculator I'd been using all week to make the same numbers add up differently, and I didn't open it right away either. I just sat there with my wet coat still on, looking at the two things side by side, the debt and the handwriting, like they were about to have a conversation I wasn't ready to hear yet. The kettle clicked off behind me before I moved, and the sound of it seemed to give me permission. I peeled my coat off and hung it on the same nail she always used, the one by the door frame worn smooth from 40 years of the same gesture, and I sat back down and opened the cover the rest of the way. The spine had gone soft. Inside, the ink had bled in places where water had reached it, but most of the pages held. Her handwriting ran small and slanted, the letters leaning hard to the right, like she was always in a hurry to get to the next word, before the last one dried. The first entry I could read clearly was dated October 12, 1974. Husks from the Kessler yard again, 3rd year running, simmered 4 hours, added the alum mordant late, too late, color fine, but fugitive, try earlier mordant next batch. Under it she'd pinned a scrap of wool no bigger than a stamp, the brown gone dull and uneven, and written beside it, in different ink, as if she'd come back to it later. Not yet. I sat with that for a long time. Not yet. 48 years of not yet, sitting behind a basin, warping in the damp. I thought about the smoke I'd been smelling for 2 weeks without naming it. The sweet, tarry smell that drifted up the valley every October from 3 miles down Bell Road, where the Kessler operation ran their huller from dawn until the trucks stopped coming. I'd assumed, the way you assume things about neighbors you've never spoken to, that it was just what harvest smelled like. Ed Kessler had shaken my hand at the funeral and told me, not unkindly, that he'd always admired what my great-aunt did out here. Before it, in the same breath, mentioned that Fisher Ag Co-op bought fleece by the truckload now and paid better than boutique wool ever did. He hadn't meant it as an insult. That was somehow worse. I turned more pages. Some were recipes, some were just numbers, pounds of husk, gallons of water, minutes on the stove, and some were nothing but a date and a single word, the kind of shorthand you only write for yourself. Near the back, tucked between 2 pages that had stuck together with age, I found a folded receipt from a feed store in Monmouth, dated September 1977, and on the back of it, in the same hurried slant, "If the color holds past 3 washes, this is worth more than the sheep." I read that line 4 times. Outside, the wind had picked up enough to rattle the loose pane in the kitchen window, the one I'd meant to reglaze since the day I moved in, and somewhere out past the drying shed, one of the ewes called out once, long and low, and went quiet again. I closed the notebook, but I didn't move it away from the calculator. I let them sit there together a while longer, the debt and the handwriting, and for the first time since the letter arrived, I felt something that wasn't quite hope, but was standing close enough to it to matter. The rain started around midnight, the kind that came sideways off the hills and found every gap in the barn siding my great-aunt had patched with license plates instead of proper board, and I lay awake listening to it and thinking about that receipt. If the color holds past 3 washes, this is worth more than the sheep. She had never said that to anyone, as far as I could tell. Not to the man at the co-op who co-signed her loans for 30 years and called her stock serviceable like that was a compliment. Not to her sister, my grandmother, who used to write her long letters asking why she didn't just switch to synthetic dye like everyone else in the valley had by then. She'd written it to herself, in pencil, on the back of a feed receipt, and then folded it into a notebook and never tried it again that I could find. I got up before 6 and went out to the drying shed with a flashlight, though I didn't need one by the time I crossed the yard. The sky had gone that flat gray that comes before real light, and the ridge to the east was already visible, dark against it. The shed still smelled the way it must have smelled in her day, lanolin and cedar and something sourer underneath. Old dye, maybe, or just 40 years of damp. I stood there a long time without doing anything, just looking at the row of hooks along the beam where she must have hung skeins to dry, worn smooth and a little bent from the weight of wet wool over decades I hadn't lived through. 3 miles down the county road, the Kessler place ran their huller from first light until near dark every September and October, and had since before I was born. I'd grown up smelling that smoke without ever asking what it was, a green, bitter smell that settled over the valley for 6 weeks every fall, and that everyone treated the way you'd treat weather, something to be endured and not questioned. My great-aunt would have smelled it too, every autumn she stood in this shed. I wondered if she'd ever stood exactly where I was standing and thought the same thought I was thinking now, or if it had come to her some other way, in some other year, and just never gone anywhere. I drove out to the Kessler yard that Thursday afternoon without calling ahead, which was a mistake I'd make more than once that fall, and found a man in a Carhartt jacket forking husks into a burn pile the size of a car, not looking up when my truck came to a stop on the gravel. He kept forking husks, the tines catching the pale gutted shells and green rinds, and throwing them up onto the pile, in a rhythm he'd probably had since before I could walk. I got out and stood by the truck for a minute, close enough that he'd have to see me, and when he finally straightened up and looked over, he had the kind of face that had made up its mind about me before I said a word. Not unkind, just settled, the way a fence post is settled into the ground. "Help you?" he said. I told him who I was, and that got a small change in him, a flicker of recognition around the eyes. Everybody in that end of the county had known my great-aunt, at least well enough to nod at her at the feed store or the fairgrounds, and a good number of them had also known, one way or another, that she was dying, and then that she was dead, and now here was her farm standing up in front of them in the shape of an 18-year-old girl in a barn coat 2 sizes too big. "Heard you took over the Corrigan place," he said, which wasn't a question, and he went back to forking husks like the conversation was over. I asked him what he did with the burn pile once it got that size. He told me what I already half knew, that they burned it, same as always, a few times a week through the season, because there was nowhere else for it to go and no reason to haul it anywhere. Thousands of pounds of it, he said, like it was a fact of weather and not a decision anyone had made. The huller ran September into late October, and every year the pile grew and every year it burned, and the valley smelled like green rind and smoke until the rains came and washed the smell out of the air until the next fall. I didn't say anything about dye. I didn't have the nerve yet, and I didn't have a single skein to show him even if I had, nothing but a torn page from a dead woman's notebook and a stain that hadn't come out of my hands from the small test batch I'd already ruined trying to guess her proportions. I just asked if I could take some of the husks off the pile before he burned it, and he looked at me the way you'd look at somebody asking to haul off your trash, half amused and half not caring enough to say no. "Take what you want," he said. "Saves me the trouble of raking it in." I filled the bed of my truck that afternoon with wet green husks that stained my forearms brown before I'd even gotten them home, and I drove back up the county road with the smell of them filling the cab, thinking about a line in my great-aunt's journal I hadn't understood yet, 3 words underlined twice in ink gone the color of rust. The 3 words were written in her hand, small and pressed hard enough into the page that I could feel the shape of them from the other side, if I ran my thumb over it in the right light. Mordant before die. I didn't know what a mordant was yet, not really, not beyond the word itself sitting strange in my mouth, like something borrowed from another language. I knew alum from a spice shelf and vinegar from a pickling jar, and neither of those seemed like they belonged in the same sentence as walnut husks. But there they were on her page, underlined twice, the ink so dark in that one place it had almost torn through to the next sheet. I backed the truck up to the drying shed a little after 4 that afternoon, the same shed she'd used, its boards gone the silver gray of driftwood, and I unloaded the husks into 2 galvanized tubs I'd bought secondhand off a farm auction site for $11 each. My hands were the color of strong tea within 20 minutes, and stayed that way for the better part of 2 weeks, no matter how much lava soap I went through at the kitchen sink. I didn't mind it the way I thought I would. There's a kind of pride in a stain you earned honestly. That same shed, in September of 1974, had held her at roughly the age I was standing in it now, though I didn't know that yet. I only learned it later, from a date scrawled at the top of the page beside the underlined words, September the 11th, a Wednesday, the same week she'd apparently gone down to Kessler's father's operation and asked the same question I would ask 48 years later, almost to the day, whether she could take some of the husks before they went into the burn pile. Her page didn't say what he answered. It only said the mordant had failed on the first batch, that the wool had taken the color and then let it go again after one wash, gone the pale ghost of brown instead of the deep one she'd wanted, and that she meant to try it again with more alum and a longer soak. I didn't have alum in the house that first week. I drove to the Sherwin's Ag Supply out on Route 22 and stood in front of a shelf of canning and pickling minerals for longer than I want to admit, reading labels, before a woman behind the counter who'd known my great-aunt asked if I needed help finding something, and I said I was trying to set a dye, and she looked at me the way people had started looking at me since the funeral. Not doubtful exactly, just waiting to see if I'd follow through, or if this was one more thing I'd let go quiet by November. I bought 4 pounds of it. I didn't know yet if that was too much or not nearly enough. The 4 pounds sat on the kitchen counter for 2 days before I did anything with them. I kept picking the bag up and setting it back down. The way you handle a thing you've decided matters more than it should. October 3rd was a Tuesday that year, cold enough in the mornings that the goat's water trough had a skin of ice on it, and I remember thinking that if I was going to ruin a batch of wool, I should do it before the real weather came in, and I needed every hour for the animals instead. I hauled a burlap sack of husks up from the drying shed, the ones I'd been collecting off the Kessler place since the second week of September, and I filled the old enamel canning pot my great-aunt had used for tomatoes, not dye, because I hadn't found a dye pot yet and didn't want to spend money I didn't have on one. The husks went dark and slick in the water almost right away, turning it the color of strong coffee within 20 minutes of simmering, and the smell filled the kitchen. Not unpleasant, more like wet bark and something faintly like walnuts themselves, though I hadn't expected that, since by the time husks fall they've stopped smelling like anything you'd want to eat. I followed her page as close as I could read it. 4 ounces of alum dissolved into a gallon of warm water. The wool, 2 skeins of the undyed fleece from her own flock, carded and spun by a woman in Independence who still ran a wheel, going in to soak for an hour before I ever touched the dye bath. I kept checking the clock on the stove, an old GE with a crack across the face, because her handwriting on the mordant step trailed off into a note that just said, "Longer this time," without saying how much longer, and I didn't want to guess wrong in the direction that had failed her. I gave it 90 minutes. Then the dye bath itself, the wool going in at a bare simmer, and here her instructions were clearer. 40 minutes, stirred every few minutes so it wouldn't strike unevenly, though the wet wool in that dark water looked less like it was taking color than like it was disappearing into it. I pulled the first skein out at 40 minutes exactly. It had gone a deep, even brown, darker than I expected, closer to the color of the barn boards after rain than anything I'd pictured. I hung it over the drying rack by the wood stove and didn't touch it again that night, half afraid that looking at it too closely would somehow undo what I'd done. I washed it 4 days later. I stood at the sink with the water running gray-brown at first, and then, slowly, clear, the color staying exactly where it was, and I had to sit down on the kitchen floor for a minute before I called anyone to tell them. The person I called was my own number, which is to say, I sat on the floor with the phone in my hand for a while before I put it down again without dialing anyone. There wasn't anyone to call yet. I hadn't told the co-op in Portland, hadn't told the woman at the extension office who kept asking how the Husk project was going, hadn't told the man at the huller's yard, whose name I still only knew from the invoice stapled to his gate. I had told the wool, and the wool had held. I thought about her doing this same thing 40-some years before, in the same kitchen, with a different stove and a different sink, and no one to call either, because by the time she'd worked it out the mill in Salem that used to buy her fleece had already stopped answering her letters. I found out later, going back through the ledger, that she'd sent 3 samples of dyed skein to a buyer in 1974 and gotten back a single line. Color is fine, but we have moved to synthetic dyes for consistency. And that after that, there was no more mention of Walnut anywhere in her hand, not one line, as if she'd decided the world had made its choice and there was no arguing with it. I don't know if she was angry or just tired. The journal doesn't say. It just stops, mid-page, the rest of it blank, until the entries about lambing start up again the following spring, like nothing had happened. I did not want to stop the way she'd stopped. I told myself that sitting on the kitchen floor, though I understood even then, it was easier to say than to be sure of. What I did instead, the next morning, a Tuesday, was drive the 4 dyed skeins into town and hand them to Ruth Okafor at the Fiber Co-op's monthly drop-in without saying much beyond that I'd made them myself, from Husks, no store-bought dye at all. She held one up to the window the way you'd check a check for a false signature, turning it in the light, running her thumb down the twist. "This is Walnut," she said. Not a question. "Green husk," I said. "Off the Kessler place, down the road, what they burn every fall." She didn't say anything for a second, just kept turning the skein, and I watched her decide something, the way you can watch a person decide something if you've spent enough hours watching animals for the same tell, the slight stillness before a shift in weight. "Bring me 20 more like this," she said, "and I'll put it in front of the buyers myself." I said I'd have to see how much husk I could get before the season turned, and she said the season wasn't the problem, the color was the problem, and the color was solved. I drove home with that sentence going around in my head the whole 4 miles, past the Kessler yard, where the smoke was already starting to rise off the first small burn pile of the year, thin and gray against a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it meant to rain. That night I called the number Dale Kessler had scrawled on a feed store receipt back in October, the one I'd stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a chicken and mostly ignored since. He picked up on the 4th ring, sounding like a man who'd been asleep in his recliner since 6. "It's Fay Corrigan," I said, "from down the road. I want to talk about your husk pile." There was a pause long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "You still doing that dye business?" I said I was, and that I needed more than I'd taken last fall, that I needed all of it if he'd let me have it, that I'd haul it myself in the truck bed with tarps so his yard wouldn't smell any worse than usual in the meantime. He laughed, not unkindly, the way you laugh at something that surprises you without offending you. "Girl, I pay a man to burn that stuff. You're offering to take it off my hands for free. I'm not going to argue with you." He said something then about his father hating the smoke too, always had, said it choked the geese off the pond some years, and I heard in it the same tired acceptance my great-aunt must have heard for decades. Waste treated like weather, something you complained about but never once considered stopping. I told him I'd be by Saturday morning, the 9th, with the flatbed and every feed sack I owned. The night before, I sat at the kitchen table with the journal open to the last page she'd written in it, the ink gone the color of weak tea, and I did the arithmetic she never had the chance to finish. 20 skeins for the co-op buyer, a standing order if the color held, if the buyers in Portland wanted it the way she thought they would. I multiplied husks to gallons, to skeins to dollars, until the numbers stopped feeling like numbers and started feeling like a door. Dale's yard on Saturday was quiet, the burn pile from the week before still smoldering faint at its base, gray-black and collapsed in on itself like something that had given up. I backed the truck up to the good pile, the fresh green husks still damp and heavy, and started loading by hand, my fingers already going that particular brown that doesn't come out with soap, doesn't come out with anything, the color I'd stopped minding months ago. Dale stood by his tractor watching me work, and didn't offer to help, but he didn't tell me to hurry either. It took 3 trips to fill the flatbed, and by the second load the sun had climbed high enough that the husks steamed faintly where I'd dropped them, that green tea smell rising off the pile the way it did every October now, familiar as wood smoke. I'd learned by then not to rush the loading. A husk bruised too hard, bled its color early, wasted it into the truck bed instead of the vat, and I could not afford waste, not with 20 skeins promised, and the buyer's assistant already asking, in her careful email voice, whether the order could be 40 instead. I did the math again while I worked, the way I'd taken to doing, breaking the season down into husks per pound, and pounds per gallon, and gallons per skein, until the whole operation sat in my head like a recipe instead of a debt. My great-aunt's journal had never gotten that far. She'd written recipes for color, not recipes for survival, and I understood now that those were different documents entirely, that she'd been an artist working alone in a room with the door shut, and I was running a business with the door propped open to whoever wanted to look in. Dale finally spoke when I was tying down the last load, the ratchet strap biting into the tarp over the husks. "Kessler's been asking why you don't just take the ash pile too," he said, "since you're out here anyway." I told him ash was a different chemistry, that I wasn't ready to mess with mordants beyond what I already had working, that one good color was worth more than 3 mediocre ones. He nodded, like that made sense to him, though I doubted it did, and went back to whatever he'd been doing to the tractor before I arrived. Driving home with the truck riding low, I passed the Fenwick place, still empty, the for sale sign gone gray and half swallowed by blackberry along the fence line, and I thought about how a farm could sit there for 2 years with nobody wanting it, and how mine had sat unwanted too, until it wasn't. The drying shed was already half strung with skeins from the last batch, hung to catch what light came through the north window, and I backed the truck up close so I wouldn't have to carry the husks far. My hands, when I finally stopped for water, were the color they always were now, that deep brown that had stopped feeling like a stain and started feeling like a signature, the mark of a season's work, written straight into my skin instead of a page. That evening, the phone rang while I was still coiling the last skein onto its hook, and I let it go twice before I wiped my hands on my jeans and answered, because the number on the screen was the Portland Co-op's, and I'd learned by then that good news didn't announce itself any differently than bad. The woman on the other end, the same one who'd stopped at my table back in June and turned the skein over in her hands like she was checking for a flaw she already expected to find, told me the fall order needed to go from 60 pounds to 110 and that she wanted first pick on whatever I dyed before the co-op's open call went out, because 3 of her regular buyers had specifically asked for the walnut brown by name, not by lot number, which she said didn't happen with more than 1 or 2 colors a year. I wrote the number down on the back of an old feed receipt because that was what was on the counter, and I looked at it longer than the arithmetic required, because 110 pounds meant every husk the Kessler yard produced that October and then some, meant borrowing somebody's trailer for the extra hauls, meant 3 more weeks of stained hands before the weather turned too cold for the vats to hold heat properly outdoors. I called Kessler the next morning, a Thursday, the 2nd of November, and he said take whatever I wanted, same as always, and then, almost as an afterthought, asked if I'd heard the county extension office had been asking around about who was doing something with the husks instead of letting them go up the flue, because apparently somebody from Salem had made a phone call about air quality credits, a phrase he said the way a man says words he doesn't trust yet. I told him I hadn't heard anything, which was true, and that I wasn't looking to be anybody's poster child for it, which was also true, though I could feel already how a story like that might travel further than I wanted it to, the way a story about a girl and a dead woman's dye journal had traveled further than I'd ever planned, when it started as 3 trial batches in a stockpot behind the barn. I hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen a minute, looking out at the shed where the brown skeins caught the gray morning light, and thought about how little any of this had needed from anyone but time and attention. No loan extension, no favor called in, no miracle, just a year of watching what other people threw away and deciding it was worth keeping. The ledger on the counter still had the co-op debt figure in it, smaller now than it had been in September of last year, and getting smaller, and I found I didn't need to look at it every day anymore to know where it stood. On the second Saturday of October, in the same drying shed with the same nail heads worn smooth from 40 years of hanging skeins before mine, I strung the season's last batch, 11 pounds of 2-ply, dyed in 3 lots so the color would vary the way hand-dyed things are supposed to, dark at the roots of the fiber and lighter where the husk liquor had thinned by the 3rd dip. The smoke was blowing east that afternoon, off the huller's yard a few miles down the valley, the same gray drift I'd watched from this same doorway a year ago without knowing what it was worth. Nobody down there had changed anything. They still burned what they didn't want. I just didn't let them burn all of it anymore. 40-gallon totes of husk in the truck bed every October now, an arrangement with a man who'd once told my great-aunt her wool was old-fashioned and told me, this September, that he'd hold the good husks aside if I wanted first pick, like it cost him something to say it, and maybe it did. The Portland Co-op's order sat on the counter next to the ledger, the number bigger than last year's, with a note at the bottom asking whether I could take on 2 more accounts in the spring, small mill shops that had heard about the color from somebody who'd heard about it from somebody else. I hadn't answered yet. I was learning the difference between growing because you have to and growing because you can, and I wanted to be sure which one this was before I said yes to anything. The skeins turned slow on their hooks, the way things do when there's no wind, just their own weight settling. I stood there longer than I needed to, the way I imagined she must have stood there 40 years back, before the cheap dyes came in and made this kind of patience look foolish for a while. It didn't look foolish anymore. It just looked like work, done right. Over time, nobody could rush. If you've been left something that looked like a burden, a barn, a debt, a stack of somebody's handwriting nobody's read in decades, I'd tell you to open the drawer before you decide what it's worth. Nobody handed me anything except a debt and a dead woman's notebook, and it turned out that was enough, if I was willing to spend a year finding out. That's the whole of it. If it means something to you, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what's still sitting unopened in your own family's barn.